Could I have your attention, please? Could I have your attention, please? Go ahead and be seated if you would. We'd like to be respectful of your time and keep it on schedule. We're giving away a free Bentley today. Your number is, check your ticket. That'll work. Thank you for being with us today. And again, we want to be respectful of your time by starting on time. My name is Dick Batchelor. I'm a member of the State Advisory Board of the USGLC and have been for some years now, and really appreciate all the work that gets done by them. I have a treat for you today, and the treat is I'm not giving you a speech. So that's your dessert. But I do have the pleasure of convening the group today, and let me just say I'm looking forward to our panel members. I know them each, and it's going to be a very phenomenal day, not to mention our guest speaker, who is in her own right. I call her a rock star. I guess that's okay to call a congresswoman a rock star. Is that okay? That's okay? Okay. I want to do that. So welcome for a very critical conversation today about global threats and opportunities facing our country today, and how America's role in the world matters now more than ever to our local communities, especially to us here in Florida. I'm delighted to be here with the Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, and I thank the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition for bringing this together this afternoon. The USGLC has assembled a powerful group of more than 200 leaders from across the state to form the Florida Advisory Committee. We are Republicans, Democrats, Independents, pillars of the community, humanitarians, faith communities, civic officials, and military veterans, and we have all arrived at the same conclusion: America must continue to be a global leader. Looking out at the crowd today, I can see that everyone in this room understands how interconnected our security and our prosperity is in this world, and that America is still and always will be an indispensable nation. At a time when America's role in the world is being debated in Washington and around kitchen tables around this country, and amid the ever-growing number of global crises, the stakes have truly never been higher for America's global leadership. In fact, as we speak, the administration is circumventing Congress and looking to cancel critical funds to our development and diplomacy programs around the world. But we know that pulling back, especially now, is simply not in our nation's interest. These are not Democratic or Republican issues. These are issues that affect all Americans, and we hope that when you leave here today, you continue this vital conversation with your friends and your family and learn about America's role in the world with your family and friends. Now, to tell us a lot more about the USGLC's work here and around the country, I'd like to introduce to you to Jason Gross, the Executive Director of USGLC. Jason.
Thank you, Dick Batchelor, for kicking us off so well and your perspective on why America's global leadership matters to Florida. My name is Jason Gross. I'm Executive Director of USGLC. It's a pleasure and honor to be here for this special event and with our very special guest, Congresswoman Murphy, who is Central Florida so lucky to have serving for you in Congress for such an important leader on America's role in the world. I want to thank you all for being here, and a special thank you to our event partners as well who've made this possible. Our Florida Advisory Committee, we'll start off with our national global impact partners who make our work around the country possible, which is so important to this organization. Also, our event partners today, our local event partners who made this event so possible. Thank you very much for your leadership. And of course, for our Florida State Advisory Committee, it is making our ongoing efforts in the state so effective and so important. And it's led in our bipartisan tradition by our co-chairs, by former Congressman Andrew Crenshaw and former state CFO of the state of Florida, Alex Sink. I want to talk a little bit about USGLC and who we are. We're very much a group of storytellers, and we tell the story of why American global engagement matters to us back here at home. And that's very much, I think, in the DNA of Floridians. I mean, this is a state with over 20% of the population are immigrants. It's a state where tourism is the #1 industry, and international visitors provide such a backbone of that tourism for this growing economy in the state. And it's a place where if you step offshore, you're looking at Latin America. I mean, this is a place where it thinks about the Western Hemisphere itself and how important this hemisphere is for the future of our country. And that's very much the heart of what USGLC does. It unites all these diverse, effective voices to tell the stories of why leading in the world matters to America. We are over 500 businesses and humanitarian organizations, from Coca-Cola to CARE, from Walmart to World Vision, who work alongside of returned veterans, of faith leaders locally, of state and elected officials, all for this effort of why civilian tools are so important for our national power. Our network spans from coast to coast, from Maine to Arizona, from Washington State to here in Florida. We have a bipartisan advisory council that is headed by General Colin Powell, and that includes a who's who of national security and foreign policy experts, and every Secretary of State from Henry Kissinger to John Kerry. We're proud of the growing military voice, growing in our coalition as well. Our National Security Advisory Council now has over 200 retired 3- and 4-star flag officers who make the case to the American people and to members of Congress, and we're proud to have one today in our panel as well. They're backed up by over 30,000 veterans for Smart Power who've returned from the front lines of Iraq and Afghanistan to tell the story to the American people about how important it is to invest in our civilian capabilities for our ultimate national security. And what brings all these diverse voices together is a firm belief in America's global leadership, and that strategic investments in diplomacy and development alongside defense are essential to advance our national security, our economic growth, and our values as Americans. What brings all these voices together in their effort is to tell a story about how this small but mighty part of the overall federal budget, the international affairs budget, is so critical for our long-term interests. Some people don't realize how diverse it is. It funds so many different capacities that we have as a country. It funds our diplomats and embassies around the world, our Peace Corps. It helps us address global health crises before they come to reach our shores, like Zika or Ebola. It has programs that open up markets for the export of U.S. goods through public-private partnerships that offer a hand up, not a handout, to millions across the globe. It's effective, it's accountable, and it's transparent, and it works on behalf of the American people. However, just recently, over the last week, we've seen this budget come under possible threat yet again from the administration right now, with reports of a possible $4 billion, up to a $4 billion rescission of funds that were already agreed to by Congress and the administration in the past. As this coalition does around the country, we've already mobilized our folks from around the country to talk to their members of Congress to speak out against it, and many have already. We hope that this planned rescission, these planned cuts don't come to Congress at all. But we know that over the past 3 years, bipartisan, bicameral leadership in Congress has stood up to these cuts and restored them. And we have great leaders in Congress, like Congresswoman Murphy, who have made a difference, and we know they'll be there for us again were it to happen. Now, you've heard a little bit about us, about what we do at USGLC. I'd love to hear a little bit more from you for a moment, if I can ask your indulgence to answer one question for me as well, to know why you came here today. In the center of your table, you'll see note cards, and it says, you'll see the question there, if you can grab a pencil on a note card for me, why does leading globally matter to Florida? So if you can put down an answer for me, write down the first thing that comes to your mind, why leading globally matters to Florida. And then we'll discuss that for a few seconds after you have some time to write down your answer. There are no wrong answers here, so. Great. Okay, as you've written down or thought about something, show of hands, first of all, how many of you had something along the lines, it's the right thing to do? It's about our moral character and our values. Show of hands for that. A few out there definitely wrote that down. You're very much in line with Ronald Reagan's refrain of seeing this country as a shining city on a hill. We are a generous nation. And if you look at our work, for example, through the Presidential Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, known as PEPFAR, we saved over 17 million lives over the last 16 years. That is an important statement of where we are as a character. But there's much more to do still. Right now, look at the world today. 30 million facing famine today across the world. Another 71 million displaced persons across the globe. The highest numbers of refugees since World War II. We still have our work cut out to us in this sphere. Okay, how many of you want more kind of a keeping us safe here at home or a national security theme? Who had that up? See the Congresswoman's hand, a few others as well. Here you're very much in line with the generals and admirals who've been testifying year after year on Capitol Hill that the military can't handle this job alone for keeping us safe. They have to work in conjunction with the State Department and USAID, and investing in development and diplomacy helps head off crises before they eventually reach our shores and potentially require us to deploy our troops. How many are thinking about the economy and economic growth and our future business? A lot of hands up on that one. For many of you know that 95% of America's customers live beyond our shores. If we're going to grow, keep our economy growing, we have to be able to reach them over the long term. 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is one of my favorite statistics here to think about when they say, does this foreign assistance even work? Does it matter or anything? Think about this for a moment. 11 of our top 15 export markets today, of America's top export markets, were once recipients of U.S. foreign assistance. That's showing why it matters and why it works. Those are pennies that we invested decades ago are now paying off for dollars back into our economy every day and showing how important it is. And we know our allies and our competitors are out there are looking at the developing world and those opportunities. The UK, Japan, Germany, not to mention China, we know very active in Africa and Latin America. And the question I think we have here today is, are we taking advantage of those opportunities? Are we keeping up, or are we falling behind? And we have a number of business leaders, I think, who are going to be part of that conversation that we have today. But let's hear from the real experts for a moment from this video. Thank you very much.
With our economy the way it is today,
some people are asking why we're spending so much money overseas
and not on creating jobs right here at home.
well, actually, we're not spending much money.
Just 1% of our national budget goes to the international affairs budget.
That's not a lot. And helping create American jobs is just what that money's doing.
If you want to create jobs, you have to create more demand for products and services.
You need more customers.
And where are American companies finding more customers?
Not here, but here.
And here.
And here. 95% of the world's customers live outside the U.S.
95%!
When we sell goods to them, they're called exports. U.S. exports accounted for a big part of our economic growth last year.
Half went to developing countries.
And their economies are growing 3 times faster than developed countries.
And every 10% increase in exports equals a 7% increase in jobs here.
So, how do we increase exports?
Build new markets for American goods and services.
Remember that 1%? America's international affairs budget helps fund programs
that improve health and education,
supports agriculture development,
builds a stable economy,
and creates new markets.
So if we don't go to the biggest, fastest growing group of consumers,
other countries will. Other countries already are.
Investing a small amount in global development and diplomacy
it's not only the right thing to do,
it's also the smart thing to do.
To make our economy stronger.
To create more jobs.
For my mom.
For my dad.
or my neighbor.
For me.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Adam Babington with Walt Disney World, and please begin your lunch. We're excited to be here with you all today, as I'm a proud member of the Florida Advisory Committee. I'm here on behalf of the Central Florida business community, businesses large and small who understand that our local economy here in Central Florida is linked to the rest of the world. Here in Orlando, as we all know, we're lucky to have the busiest airport in the state of Florida and the 10th busiest airport in the United States, which has allowed and created the opportunity for us to be more connected to the rest of the world than ever before. This has allowed us to help build up markets of visitation in a way that was unthinkable almost 50 years ago when Walt Disney World was being built. To help build those international markets, Florida businesses like ours rely on strategic investments in diplomacy and economic development to help further the efforts of the private sector to develop those markets and create economic opportunities here and abroad. In Orlando, as we all know, we're keenly aware of the impact that foreign visitation has on our economy. We know that foreign visitors stay longer, spend more, and are more likely to come back and visit more often. Therefore, understand that additional funding for programs like International Affairs Budget help keep America competitive and keep America safe. And that's why we're so happy to be a part of this event today. So, President Cornwell, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. I agree completely. I am Grant Cornwell, president of Rollins College. It's a big day right across the street today. Do you know what today is? It's move-in day. This morning, my wife Peg and I were greeting the families of 550-some first-year students who are moving into campus. So classes start next week, but it's so nice and orderly and peaceful here. It's complete chaos over there. But I also want to welcome you to the Alfond Inn, which is the Rollins College nonprofit hotel. For those of you who don't know, 100% of the net proceeds, the net profit of the Alfond Inn goes directly to fund scholarships at Rollins College. So thank you for being here. I am a proud member of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. As someone who believes that investing in global development is a basic tenet of our shared American values, it's an honor to be here with you today. Today, the United States is providing foreign assistance in new and more effective ways than ever before, and American universities are leading the way on research, service, and educational programming to make a better, safer world. We take our core mission at Rollins very seriously, and it's this. Our mission at Rollins College is to educate students for global citizenship and responsible leadership, empowering students to pursue meaningful lives and productive careers. We call these our 4 pillars, global citizenship being the very first. They are the sole purpose for Rollins College. At Rollins, about 70% of our students study abroad during their time, most often engaging in our signature approach to service and civic engagement. 10% of our student population are international students coming from over 60 countries to study at Rollins. And all students at Rollins must study a second language to the intermediate level. Investments in global education and global development are critical to tackling global challenges like poverty and hunger, disease and security. When organizations and universities partner with government agencies and U.S. businesses, incredible things start to happen. From offering life-saving medical treatment to teaching boys and girls how to read and write, to ensuring access to clean water, providing relief stations relief after disasters, or empowering NGOs to fulfill their missions, when America leads, everybody wins. And I know that Congresswoman Murphy and our guest speakers today share this understanding. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's panel. It will feature Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, who served as the commanding general of the U.S. Army in Europe and today serves as a member of the USGLC's National Security Advisory Council. And also we'll welcome back USGLC's Jason Gross to the stage to moderate the discussion. But now it's my pleasure to introduce Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, representing Florida's 7th District, a person for whom I have the utmost respect, and for whose wise and measured service in Washington I am most grateful. Representative Murphy brings a diversity of experiences to Congress that have shaped her into a champion for American global leadership. She has served as a national security specialist at the Department of Defense, and yes, she has taught business right here at Rollins College. From her work in Congress and travels abroad, she knows firsthand that investing in America's development and diplomacy programs is critical to advancing our economic and security interests. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our special guest, Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy.
Thank you for that kind introduction, President Cornwell. As President Cornwell mentioned, he was my boss when I taught at Rollins, and I guess technically, as one of my constituents, he's still my boss, as are many of you in this room. But he is someone I greatly admire and the leader of an educational institution dedicated to preparing students to become global citizens and responsible leaders. And I think that's a really worthy goal and one that I believe aligns with the mission of many of those who are in the room today. I want to thank the USGLC for inviting me to speak. Thank you, Jason. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions about my experience in Congress, about the totally, completely normal political situation we have right now in Washington, and also about the need for U.S. foreign policy to be more strategic, predictable, and rooted in our core values. But before that, I'd like to offer some brief remarks to frame our discussion and to share my personal outlook, which stems from my own life experiences. You know, I'm somebody who believes the United States can protect its interests and promote its values most effectively when we exercise strong and smart leadership around the world, using all the tools of that are in our geopolitical toolbox, from defense to economic statecraft to diplomacy to development assistance. I think that's really the best way to strengthen America and to strengthen Florida specifically. But to give you a little bit of perspective of where I come from on all of this, as many of you know, I was born in Vietnam a few years after the Vietnam War ended. And because both of my parents had worked alongside the U.S. Military as well as the South Vietnamese forces during the conflict, they faced persecution once the communist government began consolidating power in the country. And so in 1979, when I was just a baby, my family fled Vietnam by boat. We were a part of a large wave of migrants in that era who would collectively become known as the Vietnamese boat people. And unfortunately for us, our boat ran out of fuel in the South China Sea. And there we were, dangerously adrift, running out of supplies, when a U.S. Navy ship responded to our SOS call. The American sailors gave us the food, fuel, and water we needed to make it to a Malaysian refugee camp. But these service members were on patrol thousands of miles from America's shores. They were maintaining forward presence. They were deterring conflict. They were ensuring the safe passage of ships involved in international commerce. And on that fateful day that our paths crossed, these men and women who were trained for combat extended grace to desperate strangers. And after several months at a Malaysian refugee camp, again, my family became beneficiaries of American kindness. A Lutheran church in Virginia sponsored our passage to the United States, and eventually we became proud citizens. And we were afforded this opportunity because of deliberate policy choices made in Washington. When Saigon fell to communist forces in 1975, President Ford had allowed for 130,000 South Vietnamese people to migrate to the United States. But after that, America's gates were effectively closed to refugees from Southeast Asia, even though the situation on the ground continued to deteriorate. And when President Carter took office, tens of thousands of families in Vietnam, including mine, were boarding boats and taking their chances on the high seas. And as a result, there was this renewed debate at the highest levels of U.S. government and in this country about what, if anything, to do. And among the American people, it was polling negatively at over 60% in accepting additional refugees. You know, both the American people and a lot of the policymakers had believed that America had done enough. And while others also believed that this country could and should do more. And so President Carter ultimately sided with the advocates for additional action. One official who argued for rescuing and admitting more refugees from Vietnam was the late diplomat Richard Holbrooke, who was then the State Department's Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. And he said in testimony before Congress, "The motivation is simple: the deep humanitarian concern which for so long has been a descriptive part of our national character. Going back to that American values piece. And Vice President Walter Mondale had also become a convert to this cause. And in part, this was because he didn't want to repeat the moral and policy failures of the late 1930s, when the United States and other nations didn't do nearly enough to absorb European Jews seeking to escape Nazi Germany. And in that case, the consequences of inaction were catastrophic. And here in Florida, we also turned back St. Louis, sent many of those people on that ship back to certain death in Europe. So some senior Navy officials were really reluctant at this time in the 70s to use American ships to save Vietnamese refugees. They were saying, you know, this isn't a military mission, but Mondale overruled them. And the Navy soon came to cherish their humanitarian role. And as one ship commander involved in a rescue operation told Mondale, he said, quote, "I thought it would demoralize my sailors, but I was dead wrong. It's going to make a difference to the way those people think about America. Because when their life was at risk, they saw this ship with an American flag come up and these young guys go down and pick them up. They felt safe for the first time in months and probably years. The world looked better to them. It's hard to stay mad at policy like that. And thank God for those brave sailors. And thank God for those courageous and committed policymakers in Washington who argued for action and who waged the bureaucratic battles that were necessary for their position to prevail. We are a better and stronger nation because of them. And quite frankly, I'm alive today because of America's unique combination of leadership, power, and generosity. And as a result, I've always felt a tremendous debt of gratitude to this country. And I believe public service is one way that I get to chisel away at this debt, even though I know I may never, ever fully repay it. And so it was the reason that after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, when I saw my country under attack, that I felt that first call to service. And I wanted to help defend a nation that saved my family's life and had given me a chance to live the American dream. And so I left my job in the private sector and went to work in national security at the Pentagon. And it was really the honor of my life to serve alongside men and women in uniform, like the ones who had rescued my family so many years before. And in an interesting twist of fate, during my tenure at the Pentagon, I actually got a chance to help lead the US military's response to the 2004 tsunami in Indonesia. It was a deeply satisfying turn of fate. 3 decades after the US military saved my life, I had the opportunity to help spearhead the US military's effort to save lives and rebuild communities in another Asian nation. And we were doing so at a time when the US was engaged in 2 military conflicts in the Middle East. And again, seeing the comfort with the US flag flying off the coast of Indonesia, it helped us build this deep reservoir of goodwill for the United States in what happens to be the most populous Muslim country in the world. So, as you can imagine, in light of my experiences, both personal and professional, I'm really skeptical about the arguments that are being made by American politicians, whether they're Republican or Democrats, that the United States should step back from its leadership role on the global stage. I believe that any retreat towards isolationism, however tempting it might appear at first blush, will ultimately make America and its allies less prosperous and make the world a less stable and safe place. I also believe that with great power comes great responsibility. And if America fails to rise to the occasion, the world's suffering will become worse, and eventually the problems of people in other nations will come to become our own problems. And finally, I believe that every nation has an ethos, a national soul, so to speak, and that giving a damn about our fellow human beings in other countries and trying our best to empower them is a fundamental part of the American soul. We lose a piece of ourselves every time we are capable of assisting and we decline to act. And of course, America can't do everything everywhere, and nobody is suggesting that we do. But we can do quite a bit, and we ought to, for both moral and practical reasons. So what then should American global leadership look like? What form should it take? I would summarize it a bit like this. I believe America needs a skilled and well-funded military to deter conflict, to prevail in conflict if deterrence fails, and to train and support the armed forces of our allies so that together we can address mutual challenges before they metastasize into threats. At the same time, I also believe America needs a very well-resourced core of capable, clear-eyed diplomats and aid workers to help pursue peace and reconciliation, to seek justice, to protect our planet, and to combat poverty and hunger and disease. And while on the one hand, I would argue that too many Republican policymakers venerate hard power, and they don't sufficiently value the ability of soft power to advance our nation's security. But to be fair, on the other hand, I think some of my fellow Democrats are right to recognize the benefits of soft power, but are too quick to express skepticism over, and maybe even suspicion, at the prospect of America projecting hard power vis-a-vis another country. We should never be timid of that. And for me, I don't fall into either of these camps. I think hard power and soft power are each essential and often complementary elements of U.S. foreign policy. And while most people associate the Department of Defense with troops, weapons, and a destructive force, and there's some truth to that, from my perspective, I'm someone who has been both the recipient and the provider of DoD humanitarian aid. And the department has effectively used congressionally approved funds to wield soft power as well as hard power. And I think history is clear. You know, while not every problem has a military solution, certain problems do demand an armed response. For example, American military force was required to repel German and Japanese aggression during World War II. And it was required to root out al-Qaeda from its safe haven in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks. And other geopolitical tools just wouldn't have been sufficient on those occasions, just as they weren't enough to stop the mass killings in Rwanda when the U.S. opted not to intervene militarily. And that's a decision I know many policymakers from that period have come to regret. So in addition, sometimes the use or simply the threatened use of military force can be necessary to create the conditions for a diplomatic initiative to succeed, as it was for Ambassador Holbrooke in the Balkans in the 1990s. All of this underscores the point that there is a critical role for the armed forces in U.S. foreign policy, whether they're exercising hard power or soft power. Policymakers and Democratic policymakers in particular really shouldn't shy away from that fact. But it's an absolute mistake for U.S. officials to provide the military with all the funding it needs, or even more than it's requesting, while starving our diplomats at the State Department and our aid professionals at USAID of the resources that they require to execute their mission. President Trump's budget requests have sought to do precisely that. But to its credit, to date, Congress has rejected those requests on a bipartisan basis, and I expect that we will continue to do so. The truth is that diplomats and aid workers are our nation's first line of defense. They can prevent challenges in other countries from becoming crises and prevent crises from exploding into kinetic kinds of conflict or bleeding over into our borders. Showing respect for these men and women, giving them clear strategic direction, and properly funding their work is of the utmost importance for our nation's security and prosperity, particularly here in Florida. That's because Florida is one of the country's most internationally oriented states. Our economy is highly dependent on international trade, with foreign imports and exports supporting nearly 1 in every 5 jobs in the state. Nearly 22% of Florida's 21 million residents are foreign-born. Of those 4.4 million people, 75% were born in Latin America, 10% born in Asia, and another 10% born in Europe. Many of them came to America and to Florida because of difficult economic or security conditions in their native countries, the very sorts of challenges that U.S. diplomacy and aid are intended to address at the root cause. So to state the obvious, what happens inside other nations often has implications for Florida, whether we're talking about Cuba or Haiti or Colombia or most recently Venezuela. In the past decade alone, the Venezuelan population in Florida has increased by 150%, from 85,000 to 220,000. That's half of the Venezuelan population that is in America, is here in Florida. And it's here in Florida primarily due to the failings of, or this growth is primarily due to the failings of the Chavez and Maduro regimes. So what takes place in Venezuela matters directly to us. And that's why I recently authored a successful amendment to the State Foreign Ops Appropriations Bill that would increase funding for the USAID and State Department programs to strengthen democracy, independent media, and the rule of law in Venezuela. My view is really simple. We need to help Venezuelan nationals already living in the United States by granting them temporary protected status or something like it. But we also need to address the factors inside of Venezuela that are causing Venezuelans to flee their country by the millions. Otherwise, we're simply treating the symptom of the disease rather than trying to cure the disease itself. And in closing, I'll say this. You know, one lesson I've learned and relearned over the years, both at DoD and now in Congress, is that there's no neat distinction between foreign policy and domestic policy. And we don't have the luxury of ignoring the former to focus on the latter. It's not a zero-sum game. And to take perhaps the most pressing contemporary example, violence and grinding poverty in the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras are driving many citizens of those nations to seek refuge in the United States, which is testing the capacity of our domestic immigration system and causing significant upheaval in domestic politics. This should lead U.S. policymakers, again, for both moral and practical reasons, to redouble our efforts to help these Central American nations address the underlying factors that are spurring the migration. Proposals to cut off aid to these countries, like we've seen from the Trump administration, are terribly wrongheaded. They are inconsistent with our interests and they violate our values. As I said, America has a soul and we ought to protect and preserve it through our actions. So with that, thank you again for inviting me and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Well, that was a very moving discussion from the Congresswoman there to really lay out, I think, a great discussion following on. I think you saw once again how fortunate you are to have such a formidable representative for you in Congress and a great way to kick off our conversation. Great to have you here, General Hertling, as well. We were supposed to have Kerry Hassler-Radlett as well, our third panelist, the head of PCI and the former head of the Peace Corps. Unfortunately, the storms up and down the East Coast kept her grounded in Washington all day yesterday, and she wasn't able to make it. So we're going to call on some other local leaders here to make sure we get that humanitarian part of the discussion going throughout here as well. You'll remember that those note cards and those pencils are still on your table there. After we have our discussion with the panelists, we want to turn it over to get some questions from you as well in the audience. So start thinking of some there, maybe write some down on cards, and my colleagues will come around and collect them, and we'll integrate those into the discussion later. Let's start off on national security. We're blessed to have two serious experts up here in national security for part of this discussion. Let me turn it over to the audience first, though, before we hear from our panelists, in one question to you as well to kind of help set the frame here. About a decade ago, the United States was spending 80% of its humanitarian assistance on natural disasters, on tsunamis, on cyclones, hurricanes, earthquakes. Today, 10 years later, what percentage would you say, by show of hands, are we spending right now on man-made disasters versus humanitarian disasters? So we're talking about man-made disasters, we're talking about conflict states, active wars, other factors like that. What our percentage right now are we spending on humanitarian, how much of our humanitarian aid are we spending on natural disasters today versus man-made? Is it still 80%, 50%, or 20%? Show of hands who think it's still 80%. 50%. Yeah. And 20%. We saw where I was going with this for the last group there. We've inverted it that much. Now, 10 years later, 80% of our humanitarian assistance is going to man-made conflict right now, which leads me, I think, into thinking about a question to the general. I mean, obviously, so many things out there to talk about in national security: Russia, China, North Korea, Yemen, in our own hemisphere with Venezuela and Central America. But, sir, you led our forces in Iraq. You've seen fragile states up close. There's a statistic here that says that by 2030, the year, 2 billion people will be living in conflict in fragile states. So tell us from your perspective, from the military side, but also have seen our development and diplomatic programs up front, how do they help uniquely address these situations in fragile states so that we don't have to deploy as frequently to address them in the future?
Yeah, well, the best way to talk about that, I think, if I can compare and contrast 2 of the 3 tours I had in Iraq, all 3 of them were 15 months long, so a total of over 3 years in combat. The second one, during the early run-up in the war, 2003, it was a full-fledged fight, and I was the assistant division commander of a tank division. I got back after those 15 months, went back to Europe, was on the staff of U.S. Army in Europe, and my boss came in one day, and this about 2 or 3 years later, and said, "Hey, congratulations, you're now going to be the next commander of the 1st Armored Division, the same division that you were part of in the attack into Iraq." But I knew from having followed the war that conditions had changed significantly, that my requirements were going to be much different than just fighting. And when I had my first video teleconference with my boss, one of the guys that was on that screen you showed up earlier, Dave Petraeus, told me, here are your requirements as you take over the northern part of Iraq. You will have the area between Baghdad, Turkey, and Syria, an area that consists of 11 million Iraqi citizens of the 19 million in the country. 5 of the most populous cities are going to be in your area of operations. You will have 4 Arab provinces and 3 Kurdish provinces under your responsibility. So you will continue to fight the enemy with the forces you have. I was going in with about 30,000 U.S. soldiers. He said, but you will also have command of 5 Iraqi army divisions, about 90,000 Iraqi soldiers, Jundi as they are called. He said, you'll also be responsible for establishing a better political environment in northern Iraq, because those 7 provinces that are going to be in your footprint are completely out of control in terms of their representative government that we're trying to establish. So you're going to have to help establish the governors and their boards and their elected officials and their police force, and get their water running again and their electricity and their sewage, all for an assistant with the politicians. You'll also have to help build the economy of northern Iraq. And I need to tell you, General Petraeus said, I need to tell you that there's about a 77% unemployment rate right now in the north. And all those people who are unemployed, all the young men who are unemployed, have nothing better to do than to kill you. And he said, and the last thing you're going to have to do is, while we have 4 divisions under your, I started off with 4 divisions, he says you're going to have to build a 5th division, the 5th Iraqi division, plus build their police force, which was non-existent at the time. So you compare and contrast my first experience in 2003 and 2004 of fighting the enemy in Baghdad versus taking control of a large area of operation 3 times the size of the state of Pennsylvania. And I wouldn't have been able to do it without the regional reconstruction teams from the State Department, from the provincial reconstruction teams, which were in each of the 7 different governorates, the provinces that I had. These were manned by State Department officials who had volunteered their times to serve in another country. I had a critical assistance from USAID, because they were helping the farmers get moving again and rebuilding the Beiji oil refinery, what contributed to 1/3 of the Iraqi government's economy. And I could go on and tell you about all the assistance I had from State Department, from USAID, all who have, by the way, very different cultures than the military, for sure. So I had to learn their culture as much as they had to learn mine. And it was a fascinating 18-month experience. My boss, as I was leaving Europe and deploying to Iraq, said it very succinctly. He said, you know, as a 2-star general, you're not going to be able to kill your way out of this. He said, you're going to have to become a diplomat in khaki and work with these other forms of government. And I learned a whole lot over that 15-month period. And I wouldn't have been able to squash the insurgency without a combined force of diplomats and NGOs and aid workers. And that's why today I'm one of the guys, like the ones on that 6 slides, that says the State Department should probably get a big chunk of the military change. And that's anathema to anybody that's wearing the uniform at the lower level. But having seen it at the upper level, at the strategic level, it's critically important.
Thank you.
Sorry for the long answer.
No, it's a very great one. You have great experience in the Department of Defense as well. You were working on building partner capacity while you were there, coordinating our military efforts with our state and USAID civilian ones. Tell us about your experience with that and how a proposed cut like this that would happen of $4 billion over, we've already agreed, what does that do to our capacity to be proactive and address things or build relations, as you talked about in the tsunami relief effort, that amazingly that you were able to take direct participation in?
Well, so I think it was Secretary Mattis who, when he was the Secretary of the Department of Defense, said, if you're going to cut the State Department's budget, then you better give me more money to buy bigger bullets, basically. And so it reflects the sense that Mark mentioned is that this is something that when you work in the Department of Defense, you see how important, critically important, your counterparts at state and USAID are. And so it was around 2005 when this office got stood up at the Pentagon called Building Partnership Capacity. Mm-hmm. So we were a couple years into these wars, and we were finding that our military officers, our military were engaged in more civil military operations than they were necessarily kinetic fighting. And that we needed to bring a whole of government approach to how we did these types of things. And we had to also try to overcome the 15-month cycle that our military folks would be on the ground, and then they'd leave, and the next crew would show up and have to relearn how to build schools and repair waterways and those types of things all over again. So it was critically important that not only did we provide capabilities to our counterparts within the U.S. government, but also provide capabilities to our allies overseas, with the concept that if we could address some of these issues early on, we could make capable allies and allies who were capable of ensuring their own security, so that we wouldn't have to be the ones involved. And so we came up with all kinds of new authorities, went up to the Hill, convinced members of Congress to allow the Department of Defense to partner in certain ways, use money a certain way, and really started working not just in the Middle East, but in places like Haiti, pre-earthquake. We were in Somalia, we were in Yemen, a number of places where we could see the demographics and the trends were just leading to a place where it might be a really big mess if we didn't do something and invest early. And it was a new office and a new concept, and they put up this sign on the wall outside of our office that said, preventing conflicts from becoming crises. And that was our mission, our goal, was to work within our government and with our allies to make sure that everybody had the capabilities to bring to the fight, so to speak, along so that the military didn't have to be in the fight.
Two great stories from your security background, too. Let's shift over to economics right now, part of our discussion. We heard the stats before, 95% of America's customers live beyond our shores, fastest growing economies in the developing world. Let me turn it to an audience member who came today, one of our leaders, Dawn Nagy with CARE. She is part of our coalition, CARE is, of course. Dawn has traveled extensively around on CARE trips, has seen the importance of their programs, And there's Dawn there. And would love to hear from your point as we talk about the future of economic growth and sustainable growth abroad, how important it is investing in women and girls in these economies means for the future health of these societies, so they become trading partners with us in the future.
Hello? There
Yes.
we go. All right. Sorry about that. Thank you so much for the question. CARE's thrilled to be a partner today. Yes, CARE, for those of you who don't know, CARE's been around since post-World War II Europe. We were sending aid. That's where the term CARE package comes from. So more than 7 decades later, we work in 90 countries around the world on humanitarian efforts, anything from disaster relief to poverty alleviation. And so, as any group would, we're trying to figure out where the biggest bang for our buck could be, and that turns out to be women and girls, to your point, right? Women are traditionally left out of a lot in different communities, in these 90 different countries we work in. They're left out of conversations involving government and leadership. Certainly, they're the last ones to go to school, right? If a family does not have enough money to be able to send all of their children, the girls will be the first ones that don't get an education. They're also typically the last ones to eat. They may cook the food and farm most of the lands, but they are not allowed to own them. And so we have found that by investing in women and girls, you get kind of the biggest bang for your buck. They're the most likely to invest back into their families and lift their entire kind of communities out of poverty. So when we think about what that equals, that really helps to the points that have been made kind of already. It's about kind of global health, it's about national security, it's certainly about lifting up entire economies. When you're leaving out half of the population, you can't get that economy to grow.
Congresswoman, thank you very much, Dawn. Maybe you can follow on with that on the economic side. I mean, you've worked in small and medium-sized businesses. You've talked about how international this Florida economy is, how connected it is. 14 million international visitors in 2018 statewide, 6.5 million in Orlando alone, 58,000 Florida companies exporting $57 billion worth of goods around the world. How do these development and diplomacy programs kind of help set the stage, create the enabling environment so that more Florida companies can export more around the world right now?
One extra thing I wanted to just say to what Dawn's doing. I think your organization does incredible work, and it's so incredibly important because there are studies that say that when women are empowered in these countries, they tend to reinvest in education and healthcare in their communities and sort of build that out. And I know Tupperware is here, and that's something that you all promote, is empowering women to have entrepreneurial opportunities and building that out. But as it relates to economic opportunities here domestically, I mean, if you just look at, and we can talk about, we can argue and debate the trade practices that China engages in, but in the time that China has become a part of our global trading system and a player, an economic player, they are now at a place where they have more people in the middle class than we have in our country. Like, they have more than 300 million people who are part of this middle class. And that is, as countries like China and other developing countries grow and their middle class increasingly expands, that's additional markets for our products and our things. And we too often look at, or at least in this administration in recent years, are looking too narrowly at the benefits of trade and looking just at, what is the trade balance, and not maybe looking at the services and the products that we're giving, and understanding that we have a very global supply chain. You can't peel it apart anymore. Any one car has bits and pieces of it from all over the world. It's not, even if you wanted to make it just in America, it's almost impossible for a lot of products to have that happen. And we are not, I don't think that we are serving our U.S. businesses well with the trade wars that this administration has launched. Because it has opened a multi-front trade war with allies and adversaries alike, no clear goal on where we're going, and really damaging our existing supply chains, damaging potential markets, and then on top of that, rewiring the trade system. And there's no guarantee that when the U.S. comes back with its ball and wants to play again, that those markets and those supply chains will still exist the way that they do today to the benefit of U.S. companies. So, I think it's incredibly important that we have a more strategic approach to not only developing those markets, but engaging with those countries in what is free and fair trade.
That long-term horizon you were stressing too, absolutely. How about we'll talk about humanitarian values a little bit too. Question back to the audience about where you've seen, where you believe extreme global poverty has happened over the last 25 years. How many of you believe it has gotten better, gotten worse, or stayed the same? So let's see a show of hands for each of this. How many believe over the last 25 years that extreme global poverty, which is defined as less than $1.90 a day, has gone up over the last 25 years? Show of hands. How many believe it's about stayed the same? How many believe it's gone down? Last group is right, but 95% of Americans get that wrong. They really don't see any progress where it's actually been cut in half over the last 25 years. That's the importance, I think, right now of seeing that there has been progress out there, much more to do, but this combined effort of the United States leading a family of nations towards addressing global health, global poverty issues has made a difference. Much more to do, but there is progress out there too. Jen, I want to turn to you to follow up on what Congresswoman Murphy's experience was in terms of humanitarian relief and what the military can do in disaster response, whether it is a tsunami in Southeast Asia, an earthquake in Haiti. What is it about when our power to do good and do well, we can combine that military capability with our civilian know-how to make a difference? What does that do for our values and for the image of America?
It is the portrayal of America. And I was really moved by what Congresswoman Murphy said in terms of her story and the changing perception of the sailors on that ship. Interestingly enough, I'll share this with you. I have to be careful about classification, but my last job as commander of U.S. Army Europe, we had 9 contingency plans that would be applied in different parts of the European continent. A contingency plan is better known as a war plan. In case something went bad, here's what we would do. And they were on the shelf. So the potential for actually executing 9 plans was part of the thing that drove me in terms of the training of our forces and the preparation of our headquarters. But what happened during my 2-year assignment as commander of U.S. Forces Europe is we had 16 different humanitarian operations that we conducted for other countries in Europe. There are 49 countries in Europe. Most people wouldn't get that right either if you surveyed them. 50 if you include Russia, which we didn't have the requirement to engage with Russia just because they didn't feel like they wanted to engage with us. But 16 different humanitarian crises that we dealt with over a 24-month period. And I thought it was also fascinating by the fact that we moved our headquarters from Heidelberg, Germany, where it had been since World War II, to Wiesbaden, Germany. Why do I bring that up? Because every September, the Germans in the Wiesbaden area would hold a fest in honor of the candy bomber. Does anybody know what the candy bomber is? Well, for those of you who don't, during the Berlin airlift, all the airplanes would take off from the Wiesbaden airfield, deliver the supplies to Berlin, and come back to Wiesbaden. When they flew in to both Berlin and Wiesbaden, the pilots of the planes would literally throw Hershey bars out the window to the kids post-World War II to feed them. That's the only thing Germans remember in Wiesbaden. They don't remember the war, they remember the candy bomber. The face of Americans taking care of them.
Oh, that's right. Another moving story. Let's hear. I want to hear from Sean Seipler of Clean the World. You have a unique project you're working on with the tourism industry in order to help global hygiene. Maybe tell some of your story here about how addressing global health problems, global health challenges, can really also help us express our values abroad too from the private sector.
Yeah, absolutely, happy to. Thank you for having us here. So, American diplomacy globally, without a doubt, has helped Clean the World make a tremendous impact. Organizations like CARE and so many other wonderful NGOs that we partner with. 10 years ago, we started in a single-car garage in downtown Orlando with this idea that we were going to help children around the world through health and hygiene. In 10 years, because of those partnerships with NGOs, because of the American government's diplomacy and ability for us to get into countries and to do the work that we need to do, we've sent 50 million bars of soap to kids and families in 127 countries across the globe. The death rate, the children under the age of 5 dying to hygiene-related illnesses, the time we started 10 years ago, was 9,000 children a day dying. Number 1 and number 2 leading cause of death amongst children worldwide. In 10 years, this garage-run organization that sent 50 million bars of soap has seen the death rate come down by more than 60%, okay? Such a great result that the United Nations added us last year on the UN's WASH cluster, Water, Sanitation, Hygiene. So we now sit as the 23rd NGO on the UN's WASH cluster, driving the global discussion around health and hygiene. Just last week, we formed a partnership with the UNHCR, which is the agency that works with refugees. And in addition to the work that we've done in Yemen, Somalia, Lebanon, Bangladesh, and Kenya, we now will distribute 1 million bars of soap to 100,000 Mexican refugees over the next several months to help that growing situation. So, again, we're a group 10 years ago that's sitting around on upside-down pickle buckets, scraping soap with potato peelers, and here we are 10 years later with a seat on the UN General Assembly, the WASH cluster, seeing the death rate down by 65%, and those families that we see, those mothers that are burying less of their children since the day we started, the fathers that are attending less of those funerals, they know that was a U.S.-run NGO and organization that was the result of them not having to suffer and have that pain. So it's vitally important. It's the only way that we've been able to do what we've done over the last 10 years.
Thank you, Sean. More, it's great. More Central Florida leadership working on the global stage in parallel and in partnership with the U.S. government. These are really moving stories. Congressman, I want to turn back to your story about refugees, your personal story, and about how important that is also for our expression. Maybe you can even expand more upon what your moving story was there about, we know, again, 71 million displaced people around the world, highest number of refugees since World War II. What does that mean for us about how we try and help other countries deal with refugee crises, and how these tools that we have at our disposal can help stabilize a little bit more, and also, again, express that generous spirit, that ethos you talked about in your opening remarks?
You know, I'll start by just saying that nobody is a refugee by choice. Nobody decides to leave the only place they've known as home, where they speak the native language, to take a dangerous, often dangerous journey to an unknown foreign land. Nobody does that by choice. It's the circumstances on the ground in many of the native countries that are driving these migrations. And we're seeing it not just here in our hemisphere, but all over Europe. You know, there are a lot of places where there are significant refugee issues. I think for us as Americans, we are having a moment where we're having a really interesting discussion about immigration that I think has become so rhetorical that it's hard to have a practical conversation about it. And so, yes, of course we should secure our borders, and of course we should know what products and people come across. But we also should fund and provide the process for people who are seeking asylum to be able to be processed through the court systems, and provide our law enforcement that is having to work in difficult circumstances along the border the resources they need to provide a standard of care that is commensurate with who we are as Americans. Because the images that are going all across the world about the care of refugees or of immigrants in the custody of Americans is undermining our ability to have any moral position to speak about human rights. If our administration even cares about that overseas anymore. I mean, it undermines our ability to have these conversations when people see images of America not living true to its values. So it's critically important that here domestically we provide those resources to handle the situation. And again, it gets back to addressing things at the root cause. Why are these folks leaving the Northern Triangle countries? Why are they leaving the Middle Eastern or European countries, and addressing those issues? I was on a trade mission in Mexico a few weeks back, and the president of Mexico seems to understand something that we've lost sight of. He said, you know, I calculated the amount of money it takes me to identify somebody who is transiting through Mexico to get to the United States, or trying to come to Mexico from the Northern Triangle countries. I calculated how much money it takes me to care for that, catch the person, care for the person, and return them. And if I just, it's like 1 to 8 or something. If I just put the dollar into programs that changes the economic environment and the violence and helps with rule of law, things in the originating country, and prevent these people from ever leaving because they have some hope, they have the potential for a job or an opportunity, it would save me a ton of money in this, you know, catch and return. And so this whole idea of investing in democracy and economic opportunities and education in places where there are a lot of issues where refugees are originating from, is something that Mexico seems to have understood, and they are looking to gather together a nation, allies across the world to help target these programs, because we do it through NGOs and through government programs, but we need to clearly in this case have a more targeted approach. And I would say that's the kind of stuff that you know, address the root cause, and then well-resourced when you have to have the response at your border.
Our NSAC co-chair, Admiral Stavridis, talks about it in ways of preventative medicine, that the civilian tools, versus having to do acute medical therapy, which is the military solution. And one is far less expensive at the outset if you can get ahead of it and be proactive than what you have to spend if it turns to conflict and you need to intervene. Before we get to some of your questions, I want to turn to one more leader who's come to us today. That's Sarah Gall of the Orlando World Affairs Council. Hundreds of thousands of visitors from around the world come to Florida as international visitors. Make your pitch to us here about why these visiting international leaders coming to Florida as part of the World Affairs Council where you work is so important for Florida and for our nation as a whole. We've heard great stories today about how acts of U.S. government and NGOs working help our image abroad and our face of diplomacy. Tell us how these exchanges and international visitors work to help that as well.
Yes, thank you. So hi everyone, Sarah Gall with World Affairs Council. We are the local implementer of the U.S. State Department's International Visitor Leadership Program. So I'll just make a couple key points. First, just to highlight, over 500 alumni of the IVLP Exchange Program are current or former heads of state. So these are not just leaders in government, but also business and civil society. These exchanges are a critical opportunity to shape viewpoints of leaders who have direct influence on making international policy. When we bring leaders, we're exporting American values of democracy and equality. Through this partnership with the State Department, the relationships developed on these programs last well beyond visitors' time here in Orlando. So I hope that helps explain some of the benefits here to Orlando residents. If anybody's interested in meeting with any of these visitors, please talk to me afterwards.
Thank you so much. And that citizen diplomacy is so important. I mean, these are our future leaders we're going to be dealing with on the military side when they come over for joint training, on the political and diplomatic side. They're coming to our universities, they're coming to our communities, and when these crises emerge and we have to deal with those problems, having those connections and having an impression of the United States and build up there is so key that we can then build on. Let me turn to some of the questions that have been submitted to me from you. Thank you for these already. Let me start with one for both of you. Florida, as we've seen already, will be a popular stop for the 2020 presidential candidates. How do we encourage these candidates to engage on the issues we're talking about today, champion development and diplomacy efforts? Obviously, for this audience here, are really key important. How do we get that on the agenda when they're not an easy question, I guess, to start off with.
Well, I think there's going to be some winnowing before we hear about development and diplomacy on a debate stage, because at this point, what are they speaking in 30-second bursts among the 24 people that are up there? So I think it does take it's going to take a little winnowing before we start to see clear messaging out of these folks. But I think we are it's critically important that the presidential candidates have a conversation about what America's role in the world is and how they envision that. Because we have seen over the last few years a significant shift in what role America is taking in the world. And it's coming at a time when our near-peer competitors are taking a more forward-leaning role. If you look at China's engaged on this Belt and Road Initiative, which is their version of development diplomacy of sorts, and some business in there too. And they are going out there and building infrastructure and building and working with these countries all over the world at a time when we're pulling back. And we've always had these competing visions of what is the right system, an autocratic, dystopian kind of system like the Chinese, or a democratic system. And it's critically important at this moment in time, when they're leaning so far forward, that the United States decide whether or not this is a competition that we want to prevail in, that we want democracy to be the model that prevails in the world. Because if you allow China to let's just take technology for instance, lay the infrastructure for technology, what rides on that infrastructure will be autocratic technology that seeks to control as opposed to be democratizing. And to date, the world rides on our technology backbone because we have been forward-leaning, and it's our infrastructure that everything runs on, and it's our standards. Are we willing to cede that space? And so I think it's critically important, and that it'll be inevitable that they will get to serious conversations about what the U.S. role in the world is.
Too bad we haven't heard that. Something as eloquent as you put on during the debate so far, but maybe we can get lucky. I mean, General, this is, without getting involved in the politics at all, they're trying out to be, these men and women, to be commander-in-chief. I mean, this is about America's role in the world, and global leadership has to be part of the discussion of choosing one candidate that's going to be the next president.
Yeah, I happen to be, in my spare time, a huge student of leadership. And one of the things that's important to any leader is his or her value system. And interestingly enough, that relates to something I learned at the National War College as a colonel, that America's values drive our strategies, and our strategies drive our policies. We seem to have some massive disconnects between what we define as our values, what we see as important, how that's driving the strategy not only domestically but internationally, and what kind of policies result from the overarching strategies to link the ends, ways, and means.
Well said. A little more specific foreign policy question here. With the escalation of the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, how can the U.S. continue its commitment to defining global health as a national security priority?
I'll take that one. Yeah, because a guy that worked for me actually became the commander of the Ebola task force that went to Africa, and Congresswoman Murphy maybe doesn't know that you know him well, and it's a guy named Lieutenant General Darrell Williams, who's the superintendent of West Point right now. When he was a colonel and then a general, he went to be the lead of this task force. What's interesting is we can have the policymakers say what we're going to do, but in a viable society that understands the elements of national power, be they diplomatic, informational, military, or economic, you have to have someone set the stage for what you're going to do. What the military brings to the fight in any of those kind of situations are a whole bunch of people, some great processes to make stuff happen, some leadership, and some logistics. So when Darrell Williams, the now superintendent of West Point, was told, go to Africa and fix this, the dude's an artilleryman. He knows nothing about medicine or Ebola, but he worked with the right people to provide the forces and the tents and the logistics and the food and all that to do it. So that's an example when all of the elements of national power come together in a very good way to sustain what our value systems are.
And just to add to that, when I was at the department, I led one of the first efforts for all of the different government agencies to get together and do a tabletop, which is like a simulation around pandemics, because in Asia, which was part of my portfolio at the time, we were dealing with H1N1 or H1N5, pandemic influenza. And of all the things that I have been read into from a classified perspective, this was done on an unclassified level and was the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced in my life, was watching what happens to society that stems from a global health crisis, especially something that's like a pandemic situation like Ebola or pandemic influenza. And so I think from a military perspective, the general is absolutely right. The Department of Defense has surge capacity. And so they are the immediate sort of relief, and then you have to be able to transition to NGOs and civil society for the recovery and reconstruction, that piece. But often because the Department of Defense is the most well-funded, the one that has the greatest ability around logistics and the greatest number of people, they're looked to first. And from a military perspective, they understand that pandemics and global health issues can very quickly become security issues.
Right. And it's that collaboration again. We've had the military can do, but the know-how coming from the civilian side, from our NGOs, our brave health professionals on the front lines of defense, as you said. I mean, this is something where, I mean, borders, pandemic diseases don't respect borders. They don't care which side of it you're on. They're going to come over when they're ready to. And I mean, that's something where being proactive is such in our national interest to get ahead of these things before they spiral out of control and truly become a domestic issue. Maybe we have time for a couple more. This is something you talked about earlier, Congresswoman. In Florida, around the country, we've seen significant migration from Central America. The truth is most people want to stay in their countries and are forced to flee violence and lack opportunities. How do America's programs tackle root causes of migration and help the need for these people to feel they don't have to flee the country of their origin?
Well, right now, the administration would like to zero out all of the development and funding for the countries that are currently the source of our migration issue along the border. And I think that that's actually the wrong approach to what is going on. As I mentioned in my remarks, I have worked hard to get extra dollars into the state and foreign ops bill for Venezuela, for democracy, building rule of law, sort of civil society there, because this is their fight, but they could use some technical assistance and some resources, and so providing that there. Certainly, I think we should look at additional resources for the Northern Triangle to address those issues. When I talk about some of the programs that we were running back in the mid-2000s at the Department of Defense under building partnership capacity, it was like literacy programs in Yemen. It was youth employment programs in Haiti. I mean, these are things that you wouldn't necessarily think are DoD types of projects, but we were doing them in partnership with our State Department. And those are the types of programs that I think, can help address some of the underlying issues in the countries of origin for a lot of the folks who are migrating right now. But it's a fight. I mean, as you opened with that slide, that we're currently in a fight to prevent the elimination of all development diplomatic dollars. It's a difference of opinion on how you approach these things.
Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the state partnership program that's in the military, and I would guess no one here knows about this, but every state's National Guard has a partnership with another country. And I unfortunately don't know what country Florida's Guard works with, but when you're talking about the state of Georgia, partnering with the country of Georgia, which they do for less confusion purposes, when you see a bunch of kids from Atlanta landing in Tbilisi and helping that government instill the kind of democratic values that we're so fond of, it's powerful. But again, it's a combination of the State Department and the military doing those kinds of programs.
Yeah. Our time grows near. We promised to get you out of here at 1:30 as well. So let me this has been a great discussion. It could go on for a lot longer, but let me have a closing question to our panelists too to bring us to a close. We've had a great conversation about global leadership. We often focus on challenges and uncertainty, but there's also great opportunity out there. Maybe you can give us one story of inspiration that comes to mind as it relates to global development, diplomatic programs, our leadership, in addition to the candy plane, the chocolate guy. What's another one, General, when it comes to you thinking about a point of inspiration for our leadership around the world?
Yeah, the thing that comes back to me, and it's on my banner on my Twitter feed, is an opportunity I had to coordinate with a great ambassador, a personal hero of mine, Ryan Crocker, who was the ambassador to Iraq. And when I was conducting operations in Iraq, I took over from a guy who was trying to get his provincial governors to go to Baghdad to get support from the various cabinet members in Baghdad to bring education, food, things to the northern provinces. And they weren't happy to leave their safe haven in Baghdad. So my predecessor said, it ain't working. You're going to have to figure something else out. So I turned it and said, instead of going to Baghdad, let's bring Baghdad to us so they can see our problems. But in a war-torn country, you have to supply the helicopters, bring them down. So I called Ambassador Crocker, who was the ambassador at the time. I said, can you help me with this? And he said, well, I can't, but I know someone who can, and it's a guy named Barham Saleh, who was the Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq. So I met Barham, and I told him what my desires were to bring his ministers to Crete and have a meeting with all the governors and the police chiefs to solve their problems. And Barham says, you'll never get it done in a day. He says, there's too many problems up there. I said, yeah, I know, but a day's a start. And he says, well, think about that. He says, and I'll support anything you want to do. So I had kind of an evil thought in my mind that since I was providing the helicopters, when they got all the ministers to Iraq or to Crete, suddenly all the helicopters would break down. And they would have to stay until we fixed the helicopters. So we provided them food and lodging, and we kept the ministers for 3 days. They were kind of pissed about it. But the governors were very happy about keeping them there to help solve their problems. And it was because of Ryan Crocker and Deputy Prime Minister Barham Saleh, who, by the way, today is now the president of Iraq. And in combination with another guy who Ernie Odino knows, Nurshirvan Barzani, who is the president of the Kurdish region, they made this happen. So when you have like-mindedness in trying to improve the situation of your people, no matter if they're American people in Florida or Iraqi people in Crete, miracles can happen, in my view.
Oh, great power of inspiration. Congressman, bring us home with your story of a power of inspiration. You've given us so many already, so I'm asking you for one more now.
I actually think we've talked a lot about all of the different elements of national power and all of the ways in which government and NGOs and others can work together. And I think one of the best stories of how that has led to success in our hemisphere is Plan Colombia. So Colombia was, it was products crossing our borders that were problematic. Drugs on our streets, it was causing a lot of issues in our country. And we worked in a whole of government, whole of society way in partnership with the Colombian government to start to take on narco trafficking and to fight the FARC. And eventually, I had a chance to be in Colombia. They put me in a helicopter as well and flew me into the jungles where they
didn't let you leave.
yeah, it was a real interesting experience. But by the time I had gotten there, got there to see the results of this program, the FARC had become this sort of ragtag group that was living in the edges, the extreme areas. It was safe to be in Bogota, even though they still had the holdover heavily armored vehicles, because there used to be a time when there were snipers up in the mountains that would shoot at people. I mean, things had changed dramatically within almost a little over a decade. And it did so because we partnered, we worked together as a government and as a society to address something at its root cause that was having an impact on us here in the United States. And now Colombia is one of our greatest partners in the region. They are actually helping us in other humanitarian situations.
Taking refugees from Venezuela.
They're taking refugees from Venezuela, several million people. And I think that to me is an example really close to home of how you can bring together all of the capabilities that we have and reach an outcome that's better for everyone and for the world.
Great story to end on as well. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Liz Casson to close, but before I do, I mean, I'm speaking for myself, I feel like we could go on for much more than an hour than we've done right now, go for 2 more, but this has been a fantastic conversation. So grateful to, and please join me in thanking General Hertling, Congresswoman Murphy for a great conversation today. Thank you very much. Now to Liz.
As Jason said, I'm Liz Casson, and I manage the USGLC's efforts here in Florida and throughout the southern region of the country. I'm sure that I'm not the only person in the audience today who has been moved by Congresswoman Murphy's strong support for America's development and diplomacy programs. So let's be sure, again, to show her how much we appreciate her leadership on this issue. I'd also like to thank Dick Batchelor, Adam Babington, and Grant Cornwell, and the rest of our Florida Advisory Committee members. The USGLC would not nearly be as successful without your leadership and support. And finally, I'd like to thank Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, Jason Gross, Sean, Sarah, and Dawn for your participation in today's panel. As you all know, Florida is a critical part of our global community, and we need your continued engagement to show why America's global leadership matters at the state and local levels. So when Congresswoman Murphy and other members of the Florida congressional delegation speak out in support of America's development and diplomacy programs, as you heard today, be sure to send a thank you note to the congressional office, highlight it for your local newspaper, call into a local radio station, and share it with your friends and family. You are all part of an important group of people around this country who have the ability to make an impact. So it's not too early to start planning, but the USGLC will host our annual State Leaders Summit in Washington, D.C. next June. It's 2 full days of exciting speakers, networking opportunities, and visits to your congressional delegations on Capitol Hill. You can reach out to me directly, or there's sheets on your seats that you can fill out for more information, and I hope that you can make the trip up to D.C. next summer for our summit. And finally, I would invite you to follow us wherever you're active on social media, whether that's Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. We're on all of those platforms. And when the USGLC comes back to Orlando, please continue to join us for these conversations. Once again, thank you for your support, your passion, and most importantly, your voice. Because of people like you in this room and all across the country, America remains a leading force for good in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much.